It's it's a pleasure to be on Calicut again, and thanks Manorama and for hosting this Hortus festival in Calicut, a city of history of a lot of civil engagements and citizen resistance and so many cultural events, right? So, and this discussion is very relevant in Calicut's context. I think I remember this book is talking about too many events at a time span, and I think during the time in which I am talking to Rahul someday, the day prior to that, I was traveling in Calicut, and so my wife was here in Perambre. So I was traveling here, and I noticed that more than a 40 plus CA protests happening in a bus stretcher from Ramanatagara to Wayanad. So I think that may be a pointer towards the culture of resistance happening in the city. Coming back to the topic, this is a very important topic on current state of India and the transformation of how India is changing, how the citizenship and state relations are changing. And as a person who was noticing this as a part of other resistance for some time, I'm also noticing some of the events in this book very actively. And Rahul was investigating this through a long period of journey. I think my last conversation was with him was around 6 years back, I think. Yeah. So he was spending a lot of time taking a break from his professional career in Reuters into this book. And maybe we can hear from Rahul on the specific topic of this book, right? So he calls this book as Identity Project, Unmaking of a Democracy. So first question coming to my mind is how we are looking at this we heard about India's long walk to how to become a democratic republic. The history of how India ran its first election without even having identity cards. Electoral rolls and administrative reforms happened over a period of time. How birth records slowly got evolved. Then at the time of a digital transition, identity, the NRCs, CAA, too many discussions were happening in between, along with more and more targeted identities. So how we see the shift from making of a democracy to unmaking of a democracy, why that title? That may be my first question to Rahul.
Okay, thank you all for coming in, and thank you for having me over here. I've been a journalist for about 21 years now, and I have been working on this book, or rather I worked on this book for the last 8 until January this year, and then it came out a couple of months ago in India. I think, like many people, around 2013, 2012, I started seeing a shift in the environment, in the way people were talking to each other about other people, about the dispossessed, about politics, and about rights. And I was very struck by that, because this was not language that I had heard before. I was not able to articulate what was going on around me, but I was experiencing it through my reporting and through my interactions with family members, with friends. And I was struck at that moment. I knew that something fundamental was changing, but what that change was, it felt too early to say. We seem to be giving up certain rights. We seem to be handing over responsibilities to powerful people, saying this person will fix our problems, our innate problems in this country, and all we have to do is sit back and either A, vote for them, or B, give them a position of immense responsibility, and they will do their thing. We just need to let them do their job. We were not really thinking about what it takes to make a job happen. We were not thinking about what kind of institutions are in place, what kind of power structures already exist as checks and balances on overreach. We were not thinking about those things. In fact, we started thinking about those things as obstacles. That was something that I was sensing. Um, it came out in the reporting specifically when for a few years I was a reporter at Caravan magazine. And over there I would do long profiles of people who were in media or a sports administrator. There was a man named N. Srinivasan who was head of the BCCI. And I was writing about his journey and about the way he used power to accumulate more power and more influence. And I thought it was a cautionary tale. But when people started writing back, they were reading that story like, this is how you succeed in India. So there was there were obviously people looking for shortcuts. And so as a reporter, you talk to hundreds of people every year. I was taking all of this in. Now, at a certain point, I started looking at Aadhaar. Aadhaar in particular, because it seemed to me that this was a project that had surveillance in it. It was possibly a tool for totalitarianism. I had heard that there had been discussions around Aadhaar, but they were not real discussions. They were not taking people's views on board. And so I started looking at all of these things. And as that happened, as I was looking at that, I actually left my job at Reuters, where I was an investigative reporter. I left my job to basically look at why Aadhaar had happened. How did Aadhaar happen? And why was it pushed through in such a strong manner? Was it just welfare? If it was only for welfare, then why does everybody need an Aadhaar number? So these were questions that I did not really have an answer to. And I felt I should go find them. And so I quit my job. And for about 4 years, 3 or 4 years, I went around the country, I met people, and what I started to see in these conversations was that there was a failure, there was some kind of institutional failure, which again I could not describe. It was happening in villages in Jharkhand where people were dying of hunger. And when they went to complain to somebody saying, my welfare is not reaching me, they did not know who to go to. Now, you can see it as a technical problem that can be easily solved somewhere. Or you can see it as, earlier this person knew who to go to, but now they don't. So what kind of failure is this? Is it a failure of governance? Is it a failure of technology? Or is there a shift in power now between the citizen and the state? So while I was thinking of these things and doing my interviews, the CAA and NRC protests began in 2019, December 2019. And I saw that the nationalist project, the Hindu nationalist project, one of the ways in which it established itself was by designing an identification system very much like Aadhaar. In fact, 10 years before Aadhaar, it came from a person many of you may know, L.K. Advani. It came out as an identification project. And so when I looked at that, I started looking at the RSS. I started following them back in time, trying to understand the RSS's mindset, what they were doing, what they wanted, why they thought the way they did, and more importantly, what their origins were. And I don't mean origins like Mussolini and those kind of things, but I wanted to know where the thought in their mind came from. And that way I went back to the Arya Samaj in 1872, 1873. And all I saw at that point was there were two ideas of India at a certain point. One of which was what we call today a liberal idea, which is the constitution is above everything else. You have rights, you have freedoms. All of these things are assured to you to some degree. And on the other side, you had a feeling that you should have duties, not rights. That a citizen should behave in a certain way. A citizen should keep the motherland above everything else. And so when I interviewed people within the RSS, and when I went and talked to people who may or may not have been part of the riots in Delhi, the violence in Delhi in 2020, I saw that they also wanted their own version of India, of what this country could be. It's a battle of ideas at the end of the day. And the way they were thinking about it meant that India, as a secular democratic nation, would have to be dismantled in some way if that vision is to come true. And so that's where the idea of an unmaking of a democracy came from.
Thanks, Rahul. So, the time we are talking about is a very large time span, and this very large time span, the kind of identity we are, there is two concepts. One is identity, and other is identification. And identity was mostly cultural in nature. Even though you are talking about Arya Samajam and their version of identity in one way, constitutional version of identity as a unification force in another way. So administrative was mostly following this constitutional notion to build electoral roll as identity, not as electoral ID cards initially. I think then immigration threats over a period of time possibly changed the notion around identity around it, right? So I think 80s is where we are having first ID cards coming in with Sri Lankan immigration and similar threats as well. Is it threat or not is a different question, but at the same time it is coming as well. Then the Kargil war and that evolution happening. But one period is interesting for me because till some point it is an evolution of a country which born less than 100 years old, trying to build identity for its population, which is a moving population across the country, and then moving slowly into a technological governance format, where identity changing into an identification system, or maybe converging it, and becoming like a force of maybe pushing it's something like a control and managing kind of scenario than a unification force. So I specifically on certain period I like to ask, because 2009 I think is a crucial year in that way. You mentioned Advani already, so that was his election, I think 2009 election, and that is a period in UPA 1 brought a lot of IT systems that time. Some of them are for transparency. The welfare systems are transforming into transparency systems. There is also similar kind of technological systems evolving for RTI. There is community empowering systems like Forest Rights Acts are coming in. So it's mostly like open government data initiatives, open source in governance. It's all becoming like government becoming transparent to citizen notion. And Aadhaar is coming as a way of getting government citizen data using the trust peak point in governance, and nobody opposed that move. And when we look at 2020, it is a time of CAA protests. A government can't even run a census, which is supposed to be happening in every 10 years. So why this trust peak to trust loss happened?
So, I
think you are talking about the same period in the book, right?
I am talking about the same period in the book, but also I go well before that also. I just want to stop and, for a moment, take you back to the year 2000. This is a year where we've just come out of Kargil. We have just had the hijacking. And during my interviews with people, the thing that came out, what they told me was that Mr. L.K. Advani, who was the Home Minister at that point in time, was very troubled by these infiltrators and the kind of problems that they had caused. And he wanted some kind of identification system. Now, every idea has a moment in time where it can either become nothing or it reaches some kind of shape. It really does depend on the time that the idea comes out in. And at that point, what was happening was you had Y2K. And so you had software companies which had immense processing power. They did not know what to do with it. And so they were pitching various ideas to the government, one of which was digitizing the census. And the other was, they were told that why don't you create an identification project? We are interested in an ID project. And so Mr. Advani at that point called for a bunch of software companies, software services companies, to essentially create blueprints for what an identification system would look like at that time. There were several versions of them which were shown to him. He picked one which actually people say looks very much like Aadhaar today, in the way the systems are built, how there is a central pillar of information, and around that there are all these silos of data. Your driving license, your passports, everything in some way connected to this one central thing, which is a number. And so, when they were having these discussions after the consulting team had been chosen, and they were having these discussions, they would meet at the ministry, and they would discuss how one could take it forward to people. How does one convince people that they need this identification card? And in one of those meetings, somebody said it should be welfare. But what they were really trying to do at that point was identify foreigners. And the reason it's connected to what you're saying, when we think about foreigners, the way they were thinking about foreigners at that point was they were looking at Assam. And Mr. Advani was going over there, he was giving political speeches. And when he says foreigners, you know what he means. I mean, at least as a reporter, when I heard the word foreigners, I made sure that I asked people, do you think he means Muslims? What do you think he means? So I kept my questions neutral in some cases. Sometimes I would ask them for confirmation. Are you sure? Why do you think he means Muslims if you say he does? And the unanimous answer from everybody I spoke to was yes, of course he meant Muslims. Who else will he mean when you're talking about infiltrators in Assam itself? So I was struck by that. Now, when you think about technology, and every technology that is created has at some level the initial thought it's a seed. It lies inside that technology. It does not go away. The technology use may change over time. So what was built to identify foreigners at one point may be used to identify welfare beneficiaries today. But the same tool can be used for a range of things. And that is what Aadhaar is. Now, it came in 2009 when Aadhaar became a reality, when this identification project became a reality. It came out as the UID, and I was struck at that point. Somebody gave me a series of recordings that were taken at a meeting in Shimla between UID, which included Mr. Nilekani and a few other bureaucrats, with a bunch of social scientists. And so it was an open discussion that was taking place about what this identification system will look like. At that point, it was not very public. People were still trying to understand what is this project going to be and all of that. In that discussion, as I was listening to the tapes, I was listening to what the social scientists were saying at that point. They were saying that this is a tool that can be used against the population. This is a tool that can lead to tyranny, it can lead to greater surveillance, and they were also struggling at some level. They were looking back in history, they were looking at how the Nazis had used identification, and how at various points in time identification had been weaponized. But what they got in response, and I heard this on the tapes myself, was just, no, safeguards will be built in. No, we will have laws that will protect you from all of this. And so it seemed as if this identification system was going to happen in any case, regardless of whatever the objections were. Now, you have the anti-corruption movement that's happening. You have Aadhaar also that's growing at the same time. As the anti-corruption movement is going on, whatever the anti-corruption movement was at that point, you start to see a certain behavior emerge in 2012 and 13, which is the discrediting of the press and the media. I don't know if you guys remember, apologies for my language, but the word prostitutes was a very, very widely used word at that point in time. When I heard it the first time, I remember feeling very hurt and quite insulted by it. But over a period of time, the way it was deployed, the way it was used against people at a general level, and how that word spread through the population, I started to see that this meant that they were disbelieving, they did not believe what reporters were telling them. So if reporters went out and reported, there was a population that just did not want to believe what they were saying, because there was this feeling that reporters are bought out, that they are prostitutes, and all of these things were happening. And so you had a certain kind of, you could see that criticism of the government was really frowned upon. While this was going on, you were seeing less and less coverage of power and how it was working. And so, as that happened all the way up to 2020, by the time we came to 2020, you had a population that did not really believe the press. You had press that was, say, television media, for example, Republic, Times Now, a bunch of these other guys. The nightly news was clearly setting an agenda which was really, I would argue, is not in the public interest. The way they were looking at events, the way clips were covered, clips were carried on Z News, for example, which were later found to be, doubtful provenance, all of these things. And so when you come all the way down to 2020, by that time, you have protests against CAA, NRC by a student population, but you have a larger population outside that does not believe what the press is telling them. They do not believe the students. They believe there is a conspiracy. And so I, as a reporter, found all of these various things that I had been looking at and feeling, they were all starting to come together in some way. But how do you articulate it and how do you write it? That was another thing entirely. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, so another aspect coming into my mind is you are anyway did a lot of investigative journey through papers, and when I'm going through the book also, it is a book with a lot of references, right? So you went through a lot of documents, you went through a lot of interviews with full references, you are going through all this. And we usually say that government is a continuation, right? So bureaucratically, any ideas within a government will be carried forward, irrespective of who is in power. So, and what you see as a part of your research on how or when this unmaking process starts, and how they are getting influenced, and so this is always this making and unmaking is there, right? So, so where we are losing the control.
I think the unmaking of India as a democracy didn't just start after India was born, which was on August 15th, 1947. But you see the idea of it being disputed before that also. I spent a lot of time in the archives. As I said, I was looking at Advani, and then through Advani, I was looking at the RSS. And I was going back in time, and I wanted to see it at the source. I wanted to hold the documents, I wanted to hold the letters, the investigations, the police notes. I wanted to hold it all. I wanted to read them one after another and create a kind of chronology of a sort of extremist ideology. And what I saw was it began almost instantly in September 1947, when you had the violence in New Delhi. You had minutes of meetings where Nehru, Mountbatten, and a bunch of other people were discussing how do you deal with this outbreak of violence? How do they were essentially struggling to create the systems that would hold this country together and not plunge it into absolute chaos. So they were dealing with, say, for example, cholera tablets shipments of cholera tablets into refugee camps. They were trying to create more refugee camps. They were trying to make sure that there was electricity, that there was water, that they had an adequate police force. So these were the sort of things that they were trying to do. And at some point, you start to see Nehru start to grow very worried by the fact that his orders are not being followed on the street. There were police who had been given orders to shoot at rioters, but they were not shooting at rioters, they were shooting above their heads. I saw in these documents that after Gandhi's death, after his murder, there were people, there was a mass arrest and detention of anybody who was associated with RSS and Mahasabha and all of these groups. And you saw letters, absolutely panicked letters from distant parts of North India to Nehru and to various people, senior officials in the police, telling them the person who is interrogating the RSS person is an RSS person. So you saw these kinds of, I saw glimpses of these things. I saw glimpses of when, of what may have occurred when positions of responsibility were essentially emptied out, vacated, because people had to leave to Pakistan. And those were filled with people who had a different idea of India from Nehru himself. And so you start to see this friction, this tension, it starts to emerge almost immediately. And you can see that Nehru is completely flummoxed by it. Because, as you know, he is anti-communal at that point in time, very, very clearly. He sees a communal mindset start to emerge at the lower levels of government. And you hear him, you actually read him questioning, why was this person hired over here? Why was this person given this responsibility? Why have these arms shipments been diverted to these people instead of the forces it was supposed to go to? So you see him starting to grapple with the size of the communal nature around him. He sees it in various government departments. He sees it in various chief ministers. He sees it in various leaders of various provinces. And that unmaking, I would say, today when we start to think about the more mystifying things that happen to us, like with the police, with the judiciary and all of these things, honestly, the question that sometimes I wonder about is, who is this guy, the person who passed that order? Where does he come from? What does he believe in? So these are questions that I personally grapple with. And I think when I was interviewing people for the book, especially towards the end, I met a lawyer who was the legal cell head for the VHP in New Delhi. We were just chatting one day at his office, his chambers, and at that point there was this movie that had come out, I think just a few months before, called was it Raman or something like that? It had Saif Ali Khan in it, and there was a quote somewhere that had said, "What is this movie? Nonsense movie," or something like that. And I just happened to talk to this guy, and I said, "What did you make of that?" And he said, I don't think he was talking about this particular instance, but he said that, yeah, sometimes you can see sort of, the word he used was Sanatani. He used that word when we were talking about certain decisions that don't make sense to me, but made complete sense to him. And so when we talk about the unmaking of a democracy, I think it's more the idea of a democracy. Like, what does a democracy have? It's got rights, it's got freedoms that we all have, but there is a dominant idea which is against all of these things. And so that's where the unmaking of it came from.
And there is this idea of this new India floating around for some time, right? So, for example, from Arun Jaitley, from Vivek, from many similar, Nandan Nilekani writing about imagining new India. So this, at one side we are seeing a lot of new India kind of philosophies floating around. And who is defining this new India? And how you see the transition from the existing framework into this new India? And many of this also, you can see that either it is an economic framework, or it is a framework in which um, mostly like a techno governance is playing an active part. And anyway, your book has a chapter totally on identity as well as the resistance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I honestly, I think um, the new India, as I think you. Okay, so there are two things over here at work. One of which is in India, my book is called The Identity Project. Outside it, it's called The New India. The reason we didn't use the New India inside India was because it has a particular connotation. It's Naya Bharat. It's been used in a certain way, in a very triumphalist way. I think that it has been used triumphantly at one level. The other thing is, it's also a way of, I think, when I look at it as a reporter, I think everything around me feels the same at some level. The casteism, the sort of institutional breakdown that you see, it all feels a little crumbly at some level. And so, what is the new India? Is new India the digital veneer? Is it the marketing veneer? Is it a spiel for investors, or is it a pitch to the people of India itself that you're making something new? I think at some level it's all of these things. I think it's an invitation to people, like, here's a new kind of country. You're going to be a participant in it, and I think it was employed very, very profitably about a decade ago. So that's what I've got to say on that one. So here's the thing. I want to ask you something. This particular panel is, or rather this discussion is about early warning signs for democracy. In the course of my reporting, what I saw was that systems were constantly subverted, constantly. And if there was any safeguard, it was thrown out the window. And people did what they wanted to in the name of progress. It was almost like citizens and friction, the friction that comes from people speaking their minds, was to be done away with at some level. When you were in the thick of Aadhaar and you had these cases, you were going to court, and you saw the way Aadhaar was being imposed, did you feel that there was a threat to our democratic structure? Or did you feel there was some deeper thing that people should have been talking about and really reacting to, but were not doing at that point in time?
So I think from the time 2009, I was active in free software movement at that period of time. And 2009, when this project got announced, there was two viewpoints. One is about pushing more free and open source systems into governments. That is one set of people. Another set of people was thinking that all over the world, the history of identification systems are automatically governments taking over control. And that is one. And how to prevent that from happening. And whenever identification systems getting pushed, it is basically becoming a point of exclusion rather than inclusion. Primarily because of these systems are basically pushing for an authentication overhead all the time. So you need to prove yourself to your right to entitlements all the time. Then it was till that point, it was mostly like you may have the identification documents, but at the same time, it is mostly like a state's duty to give a universal franchisee for the citizens. Giving, for example, universal education, universal ration, everything was universal. It is not targeted like today, right? So it's this thought process change is primarily a push anyway, but at the same time, when the technical systems are getting defined, we also know the other problem, because engineers in this country is not trained in humanities. They are going to build systems which is easier to scale. For example, what we have seen with Aadhaar is a similar point, right? They built a system which is faster to enroll, but at the same time, not good in ensuring the inclusion. So we have seen many deaths over a period of time, many exclusions over a period of time, and it is becoming like a point in which they have to re-enroll everyone with a mandatory push at this point, even with an auditory point. So this was there. So all the resistance was initially emerged from technologists who understand the risk, who become the initial set of petitioners in one level. And over a period of time, it is also becoming like what is how each and every technical documents can be reviewed, how that can be criticized. Maybe it is a history of first point in time where a technology brought into a court trial. Historically, we know that whether it is any kind of a dam project or anything, whatever IIT say or whatever CDAC says is the final, government authority says is the final answer. Other case was a rare instance in which we could able to bring a technology into a court and at least question is it the way it's supposed to be implemented, right? And anyway, it is all ended with a PowerPoint presentation for UIDA. That's a different point altogether. Right?
Yeah. So look, I have a question for you, which is, I think it speaks to something about that I've been feeling for a little while, which is that citizens' voices are not really heard in the process of governance, at least the way where I experience it. So, why do you think, or rather, let me begin by asking you this: do you think that the criticisms and critiques that were expressed by people who understood systems, experts, whether they were social scientists, who knew how hunger worked, who knew how welfare delivery actually worked, do you feel like all of that was ignored, or were some bits of what they knew taken on board in the creation of Aadhaar?
So this is an interesting aspect. So when you look at always the expectation from tech, state of technology versus expectation from technology, this is always there is a difference. So for example, right now we are hearing that AI will solve this, AI will solve that, everything. But if you look at the status of what is the state of technology versus what is available as a part of technology, there is a significant difference. For example, governments will think that this will allow people to speak in their own language, live translation of that will be available in other languages. Too many things we are seeing as a part of the current narrative. But it is, the same thing was applicable to Aadhaar. Aadhaar came as a magic bullet.
Yeah.
It was supposed to solve so many problems together in a bureaucratic narrative. But at the same time, we know that how much amount spent on top of it, how much it sold, how much not sold. So that is an evolution always, right?
Yeah. And do you feel like the lack of pushback, the absence of pushback, and this will be my last...
Yeah, I'll tell you a story on the same aspect.
Okay.
So this was actually a conference we organized in Bangalore. We actually brought people who designed the systems, even including Aadhaar, enrollment system of Aadhaar, into the conference. We brought them into the discussion, pointed them all the issues around how rubber stamps are getting used, how the verification of a person is bypassed, how it is becoming like a lot of fakes as a part of account, how even Aadhaar Pragati Maidan enrollment center is hard-coded as a part of a GPS system. And any systems over a period of time, we have a culture of using pirate software. Same thing happened with Aadhaar. Too many things have happened. So we brought all these questions as a part of a presentation in a technology conference, presented in as a part of people who design the systems, including UIDA CISOs. And the perspective came out of that was we had a system which need to be solved, but the control is not with us.
Right.
So they are all out of the system, but they are realizing the problem years after they built it.
Got it.
Right. Coming back to one of the points you said, you spoke to a lot of people in the resistance. Talk a little more about the resistance around identity. I'm not talking about Aadhaar resistance alone. I am talking about overall this tendency of identification project which is happening. And what are the kind of resistance you saw and how you see that as a part of whole journey so far. And is it winning, or is it how much they can able, because it is always about shifting sides, right?
Yeah, so one thing that and I'll take about a couple of minutes, and then we'll just open it up to you. One of the things that I saw as I reported the book was that for me, identification and identity became intertwined. The reason for that was that I felt that identification was used to persecute people of a certain identity. And I saw it over and over again over decades, after riots, during periods of massive upheaval. So I saw all of that. And so the people I spoke to, whether they were pushing back against Aadhaar or whether they were pushing back in the aftermath of riots, they were pushing back A, in the courts, and B, they were pushing back against this idea of identity becoming everything. It being at some level, they wanted to be identified as Indians, not as Hindus, not as Muslims, not as a minority or whatever it was. They just wanted to go about doing their business, being citizens of this country. And I saw then, at that point, that we don't hear from them. Like, we don't hear from people who've suffered very often, people who are subject to like massive injustices in this country. And as I was doing these things, I felt like at some point, almost I wanted to meet the people who were pushing back against the identification project. I wanted them to meet with the people I met in East Delhi who were pushing back against identity, because they would have found common cause. And I'm really happy to say that at the book launch in Delhi, I managed to sort of convince two of them to meet each other. One of them was Usha Ramnathan, and the other was a protagonist in the book, a man named Nisar, who loses his house after the Delhi violence happens. His house is burnt down and he's chased out of his neighborhood. And they were both on stage discussing what it was like to be a citizen of this country. So I'll just leave it at that right now. Thank you.
Let's open the floor for Q&A. Yeah. Any
Question, kindly pass the mic.
Thank you, Anivar ji and Rahul ji, for your new clear revelations about the new India, how it is taking shape. New India is slowly moving towards authoritarianism. The rulers started to behave like autocrats. They introduced new rules and laws to control its citizens, their citizens. They introduced new tools to tame their citizens like Aadhaar. They took control of a major chunk of the media and newspapers to propagate their ideas about the new India, how new India should be suitable to their own interests of anti-pluralism. Like many citizens of India, I also share your apprehensions. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, you were talking about Aadhaar. Aadhaar was introduced by UPA, but a REAP benefited by the NDA, especially Narendra Modi and his government. So, do you think that there was any conspiracy, like that when UPA introduced Aadhaar, people were expecting, like that now it is a surveillance, we are benefiting the benefit by by Aadhaar. That is the reason that was introduced by Nandan Nilekani was the that I think chief architect. So what happened? That can you tell us the transformation happened? Initially that the purpose was serving the society, but that now there is a suspicion, like that our data are the theft or something. Yeah.
It's if you look at evolution, 2009 BJP manifesto mentioned specifically about a project called MNIC, Multi-Purpose National Identity Card. Even though BJP failed in that election, next UPA came into power, and BJP's focus was mostly from a Kargil background, and same project will automatically transformed into Aadhaar with a welfare focus, because UPA 1 had a welfare focus. And in UPA 1, UPA 2, it was two ideas. One is Aadhaar, another is NPR, which is fighting each other. After some time, Aadhaar became back end of everything in Nandan Nilekani's own words. So that's a transition.
This will be the last question.
Hi. I want to know if you managed to talk to Nilankari and get his opinion of what he thinks that happened to Aadhaar. Does he have an opinion how it got misused or waylaid?
So his opinion is out there everywhere. He has, I think, been a big defender of Aadhaar. I think, as I was reporting the book, I essentially looked at everything that was in the public domain, because it told me everything I needed to know. I knew of what was happening in the meetings. I knew of conversations that were taking place. Not every conversation, but a few. And they told me how he was thinking about Aadhaar. It is, the defense essentially was that, look, it's a tool, like a knife. It can be used to kill somebody, or it can be used to cut a fruit. But that was not the criticism of the idea of a technology like Aadhaar. The criticism was, what are the safeguards in place? How are you going to protect people from the misuse that can occur from identification, that has occurred from identification in the past? And it felt, even as, I'll tell you something, even as a reporter, when I was thinking about Aadhaar back in 2016 and 15, many of the criticisms and the fears that I heard coming from people who were against Aadhaar felt almost theoretical. They did not feel like rooted in something. But when I hit the archives and I looked at how identification had been used over a period of time, about how during riots, people would go to the police and saying, don't attack this group of people that are wearing white kerchiefs around their hands. And I started to build a mental map of what happens when identification is misused. I saw that, my goodness, it was actually rooted in reality. So I'm saying that history was not considered. History was not a consideration when it was not a meaningful consideration, and if it was, I don't see the evidence of it, like those safeguards were built in over here. As far as the public sort of statements about it are concerned, I think it's been entirely in defense of Aadhaar, and it's now being pushed as a bundle of things called digital public infrastructure across India and across various parts of the world. I've seen one of these presentations myself. I went there and was witness to it, and I saw that it was tremendous marketing, but the people who opt to use it, or the populations that will be subject to it someday, may not know what will hit them, just as many of us didn't quite know what hit us when Aadhaar came tumbling down on all of us. So, yeah.